The finality of the oak door closing was a sound like a bone breaking. It was the last sound of her old life. On the other side stood her husband's father, a man whose face was a map of hard lines and harder judgments. In her hand, Elara clutched the $20 he had pressed there, the coins still holding the warmth of his reluctant palm. In her other hand was a folded deed, the paper dry and brittle as a dead leaf. It was for 5 acres of what he called scrub and ruin, north of Promise Creek. Liam's only inheritance. Her only inheritance now. At 19, she was a widow, and she was in exile. The town of Promise Creek watched her go. They were not unkind, but their pity was a heavy blanket that threatened to smother her. It was in the eyes of the women who offered her a place by their fire for a night or two, a temporary charity she knew would curdle into obligation. It was in the gruff advice of the men who told her to take the stagecoach east, to find work in a city where no one knew her name or her sorrow. Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, had peered at her over his spectacles, his voice thick with pragmatism. "That land ain't worth the paper it's written on, girl. A giant fell on it 40 years back, snapped the spine of the earth. You'll get maybe $5 for the deed from the timber company for salvage rights. Take it. It's more than you've got now." She looked at him, her face smudged with dust from the road, her eyes holding a stillness that unnerved him. She had Liam's dog, a scruffy shepherd mix named Boro, sitting quietly at her feet, his amber eyes fixed on her as if awaiting a command. The dog was all she had left of him. That and the memory of his laugh. She slid 4 of the $20 across the worn wooden counter. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice quiet but not weak. "And a shovel." "And the sharpest saw you have." Mr. Gable blinked, taken aback by the sheer foolishness of it. He sold her the tools, along with a sack of flour, a block of salt, and a bag of dried beans. He watched from his doorway as she loaded the goods onto a small, rickety handcart she'd bought for $1. She did not look back. She turned her face toward the northern trail, her hand resting on the splintered handle of the cart. Boro trotted ahead, then circled back, nudging her hand with his nose, a silent promise of companionship. The town saw a girl walking toward her own demise, a pitiful figure against the vast, indifferent wilderness. They saw a fool chasing a ghost onto a worthless plot of land. Elara felt their eyes on her back, but she did not care. Submission was a cage, and charity was a different kind of prison. Out there, in the ruin, she would be poor and she would be alone, but she would be free. The choice was not a choice at all. It was the only path left. The journey was a lesson in the cruelty of weight and distance. Every rock in the trail seemed to grab at the cart's clumsy wheels. The weight of the axe and shovel felt like an anchor, pulling her back with every step. The landscape grew wilder, the gentle hills around Promise Creek giving way to steep, pine-choked ridges and deep, shadowed valleys. The air grew colder. For 2 days she walked, sleeping rolled in a thin blanket with Boro pressed against her for warmth, his low growls her only shield against the noises of the night. The isolation was a physical presence, a constant pressure against her ears. She was leaving the world of men behind, walking into a silence that was older than any town, any memory. She found the surveyor's marker, a weathered stone half swallowed by moss, and knew she had arrived. And for the first time since the door had closed behind her, her resolve crumbled into dust. Despair, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced her heart. The land was not just worthless, it was a wound. A gargantuan redwood, a titan that must have been ancient when the mountains were young, lay dead across the entire plot. It had fallen from the ridge above, and its impact had shattered the earth. The trunk, wider than a house, formed a great, impassable wall of wood. Where its roots had been torn from the ground, there was a cliff of dark soil, tangled roots, and splintered rock that clawed 20 feet into the sky. The crater it left behind was a swampy, shadowed pit filled with stagnant water and buzzing insects. Mr. Gable was right. Her father-in-law was right. The whole town was right. It was a place of death, a grave. A cold drizzle began to fall, turning the air to mist. Ilara sank to the ground, the last of her strength draining away. She pulled her knees to her chest, the rough wool of her skirt soaking through with dampness. Boro whined, licking the tears from her cheek. She looked at the colossal wreck, the splintered wood, the ugly scar in the earth, and saw her own life reflected back at her. Broken, uprooted, ruined. For a long, hollow hour, she sat there and let the despair wash over her, a tide of hopelessness so complete it felt like its own kind of peace. There was nothing left to do. The wilderness had won before she had even begun to fight. The wind picked up, driving the rain sideways in stinging sheets. Shivering, she sought the only shelter available. She scrambled down into the crater and pressed herself against the massive, upturned root ball. And then she felt it. The wind stopped. Not lessened, but stopped completely. The air against the wall of earth was utterly still. The sound of the gale rushing over the top of the root cliff was a distant roar, like a river overhead. She pressed her palm flat against the dark soil between the gnarled roots. It was cool, but not cold. It held a deep, resonant stillness, a thermal weight that seemed to push back against the chill of the day. She looked down. Her boots were sinking into thick, heavy mud. But when she scraped a bit of it onto her palm, she saw it wasn't just mud. It was clay. Rich, dense, gray clay, the kind used for making bricks and pottery. Her grandfather had been a mason, and she had spent summers as a child playing in his workshop, the feel of wet clay a familiar comfort. Then her eyes caught a movement. From a thick, hairy root near the bottom of the earthen wall, a single drop of water emerged, glittered for a second, and fell. Another followed, and another. A slow, steady seep of clean water filtered through 100 feet of earth. Still air, stable temperature, clay for building, water for drinking. The despair did not vanish in a triumphant flash. It was burned away, slowly, by the rising heat of a new and terrible resolve. This was not a grave. It was not a ruin. The tree had not destroyed the land. It had created a fortress. The fall of the giant had carved out a foundation, raised a wall, and uncovered the materials to build. The town was wrong. They saw a fallen tree. She saw a roof. They saw a hole. She saw a home. The work began with the shovel. It was an enemy in her hands for the first few days, clumsy and heavy, raising blisters that broke and bled and hardened into calluses. She did not try to fill the crater. She began to deepen it, to shape it. She dug into the earth wall beneath the protective overhang of the root ball, carving out the beginnings of a room. The clay was heavy, and each shovelful felt like lifting a stone. She worked until her muscles screamed, and her back was a single, solid knot of pain. At night, she would collapse by her small fire, too tired to eat, while Boro watched over her, a silent, furry guardian. Slowly, agonizingly, the shape of a life began to emerge from the dirt. She used the axe and saw to cut timber from smaller trees on the property, felling them and dragging them to her pit. These became the support beams for her dugout, wedged against the underside of the massive redwood trunk that now formed the main beam of her roof. The log was so immense that it spanned the entire width of the crater, a permanent, unmovable ceiling. She dug deeper, creating 2 chambers. The first, smaller and closer to the entrance, was for her. The second, larger and set further back under the bulk of the log, was for animals. A stable, protected on all sides by the earth and above by a shield of wood thicker than any castle wall. Her greatest innovation was born from the clay. She remembered her grandfather's lessons, the way he mixed straw and water into the earth to give it strength. She gathered dry grasses from the meadow beyond the fallen tree and spent days stomping them into the wet clay with her bare feet. The thick, fibrous mud was exhausting to work, but when she formed it into rough bricks and left them to bake in the sun, they became hard as rock. She used these to build up the walls of her dwelling, to create a partition between her room and the stable, and, most importantly, to construct a hearth and chimney. The chimney was a clever piece of engineering born of desperation. She found a hollow space between two of the largest roots in the earthen wall and carefully lined it with her clay bricks, creating a flue that vented the smoke up and out through the top of the root ball. From a distance, the thin wisp of smoke was nearly invisible, dissipating into the tangled mass of roots and brush. She built a door from thick planks, with a heavy wooden bar to secure it from the inside. She channeled the water from the seep into a deep pit, which she meticulously lined with a thick layer of puddled clay, creating a waterproof cistern that held a constant supply of fresh, cold water. The first time she lit a fire in her new hearth, the smoke drew perfectly up the hidden chimney. The warmth filled the small, subterranean space, pushing back the damp chill of the earth. She sat on the packed dirt floor, Boro's head in her lap, and watched the flames dance. It was not a house. It was a cave, a burrow, a hole in the ground. But it was warm, it was dry, and it was hers. A quiet, fierce pride settled in her chest. She was still there. After 6 weeks of relentless labor, she knew she needed more than just shelter. She needed life. She walked the long miles back to Promise Creek. The townspeople stared. The girl who had left was gone. In her place was a woman who was leaner, harder, her face browned by the sun, her hands scarred and calloused. Her dress was stained with clay and pine pitch. She walked with a steady, purposeful stride that held none of the hesitation they remembered. She went directly to Mr. Gable's mercantile. The store fell silent as she entered. Mr. Gable looked up, his jaw slackening in surprise. She did not look like a victim anymore. She looked like a part of the wilderness itself. She ignored the whispers and the stares, walking to the counter and placing her remaining few dollars on the wood. "I need to buy 2 milk cows," she said, "and a half-dozen chickens." A ripple of disbelief went through the small crowd. Mr. Gable found his voice, a smug, condescending tone. "Cows? Girl, where in God's name do you plan to keep cows? You can't build a barn in that wreck of a plot." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The wolves will have them before the first snow. They'll smell 'em a mile off. It's a waste of good money. Your last money, I'd wager." Elara met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes were clear and steady. "My shelter is secure." "Secure?" he scoffed, laughing to the men gathered around the stove. "She's dug a hole, boys. Calls it secure." The men chuckled. The name was born in that moment. The Folly Girl. The girl who lived in a hole under the Redwood Folly. The joke spread through town before she had even paid for the animals. She bought the youngest stock he had, 2 small heifers that were barely more than calves, and a crate of noisy chickens. She said nothing more to Gable. She simply turned and led her small, pathetic-looking herd out of town. The sight of the slender woman, her dog at her side, leading 2 calves and carrying a crate of chickens toward the most useless piece of land in the county, became the defining story of that autumn. It was a tale of grief-stricken madness, of stubborn, pointless pride. The journey back was harder than the first. The calves were skittish and the chickens were loud. But when she finally guided them down into the dugout, they calmed almost immediately. The earthy smell and the enclosed space seemed to soothe them. She had built stalls in the back chamber, filled with dry grass for bedding. The chickens found a corner and began to scratch contentedly. That night, the sounds in her home were different. It was not just the crackle of the fire and the sigh of the wind. It was the soft sound of cud being chewed, the gentle shifting of livestock, the rustle of feathers. They were the sounds of life. Boro, her ever-present companion, seemed to understand. He laid his head on his paws, watching over his new flock, a quiet contentment in his posture. He was her anchor in the vast sea of solitude, his loyalty a warmth that the fire could not provide. The mockery from the town was a distant noise, but it reached her nonetheless. A hunter, Brant, passed by her land one day and saw the faint wisp of smoke rising from the root ball. He came closer, peering down into her hidden world. He saw the cows in their earthen stall. He went back to town, and the story grew. They called her the Root Witch now, living underground with her beasts. Mr. Gable polished the story every time he told it, describing her as half-wild, living in filth, destined to be starved or frozen out by midwinter. The narrative was set. She was a tragedy in the making, a cautionary tale about what happens when a woman refuses sensible advice. Then the first snow fell, and the world outside her shelter transformed. The deep winter set in. Her life shrank to a series of simple, repeating rhythms, a quiet liturgy of survival. Each morning, she would rise in the dim light that filtered through a small, skin-covered window she'd set in the door. The first task was always the fire, feeding the hearth that was the warm heart of her world. Then she would milk the 2 cows, their milk a rich, life-giving gift. She would feed them and the chickens, their calm animal presence a bulwark against the crushing loneliness. Her days were spent chopping wood from the seemingly endless supply of the fallen redwood, checking the snare lines she had set in the woods, and maintaining her home. The earthen walls sometimes sweated moisture, and she learned to manage the dampness. She repaired the chinking, reinforced the door against the growing drifts, and kept her small world ordered and clean. The thermal mass of the earth was a miracle. While the wind outside screamed like a banshee and the temperature plunged far below freezing, inside her shelter it remained a steady, cool temperature that the fire easily turned into comfort. She was not fighting the cold, she was simply outside of its reach. The town had built their homes to stand against the wilderness. She had built hers to be a part of it. She was utterly alone, a hermit in a hole, the subject of pity and scorn. But she was not helpless. In her small, warm, life-filled burrow, she was the sovereign of her own world. The first real test came not from the cold, but from teeth. A pack of wolves, lean and hungry from the hard winter, caught the scent of her livestock. One night, their howls surrounded her dwelling, a chilling chorus of hunger. Boro stood before the door, a low, rumbling growl deep in his chest. Elada's heart pounded against her ribs. She could hear them scratching, sniffing at the edges of the heavy door, whining in frustration. They circled the great root ball, confused. The scent was strong, but the source was buried, muffled by a dozen feet of earth and wood. They could not pinpoint the entrance, could not find a weakness. For hours, the siege continued. Elada sat with her back to the door, her axe in her hands, listening to the sounds of the predators and the calm, untroubled sounds of her cows chewing their cud just a few feet away, completely unaware of the danger outside. The wolves never found them. By morning, they were gone. The shelter had held. The system had worked. The town was wrong. The blizzard arrived in the 3rd week of January. It did not come like a normal storm. It descended like a hammer blow from a colorless sky, a sudden, violent onslaught of wind and snow that erased the world. The people of Promise Creek called it the White Death, and for good reason. It was a storm beyond memory or prediction, a physical entity that clawed and battered and screamed. The snow was not flakes, but a blinding, horizontal torrent of ice particles that buried everything in its path. Inside Elara's hold, the world was quiet. The roar of the storm was a dull, distant thunder, a sound from another universe. The fire in her hearth burned steady and bright. The animals were calm, sheltered from the wind that was killing their kin all over the county. The water in her cistern was clear and cold. Her neatly stacked rows of firewood, cut from the portion of the giant redwood that extended into her living space, were dry and plentiful. She was not fighting the storm. She was an island of calm in the heart of its fury, living within the systems she had so painstakingly built. In Promise Creek, it was chaos. The conventional wisdom of frontier building proved to be a fragile defense against such a cataclysm. The snow, heavy and wet, accumulated on roofs at an impossible rate. The first to go was the roof of the livery stable, collapsing with a sound like cannon fire and trapping the horses inside. Then the meeting hall's main beam cracked under the strain. Log cabins, which were meant to be sturdy, became death traps. The wind forced snow through the smallest chinks in the walls, melting and freezing, coating everything in a layer of ice. Firewood, stacked in lean-tos and outdoor sheds, was buried under 10 feet of snow, as inaccessible as if it were on the moon. Families huddled together in a single room, burning furniture to stay alive. The town's confidence, its rugged self-assurance, shattered like ice under a boot. They were trapped, and they were freezing. The sound was almost too faint to be real, a desperate, rhythmic thudding that was nearly swallowed by the howl of the wind. Boro heard it first. He shot up from his place by the fire, a sharp, urgent bark ripping from his throat. Elara put a hand on his back to quiet him, straining her ears. There it was again, a frantic, muffled pounding on her door. Someone was out there. No one could survive in this for more than a few minutes. She braced herself, lifted the heavy bar, and pulled the door inward. A wall of snow collapsed into the room, and with it, a figure, a man so covered in ice he was more statue than human. He fell to the floor, gasping, his face a mask of frozen agony. As the snow melted from his coat, she recognized him. It was Mr. Gable. His lips were blue, his words broken shards of breath. "My boy, my youngest, the fever, house is so cold." He was sobbing, not from sorrow, but from the sheer physical pain of thawing. He had tried his neighbors first, he stammered. One family's chimney was blocked, their cabin filling with smoke. Another's roof had caved in. He had come to her last, a final, desperate pilgrimage to the folly he had so often mocked. He was not asking for help. He was begging for it. For a single, fleeting second, Elara felt a cold, hard knot of satisfaction. She remembered his smug laugh, the whispers, the nickname. She remembered the faces of the men in the store, their condescending amusement. She looked at her woodpile, so carefully rationed, enough to last her until the spring thaw, if she was careful. Sharing it meant risk. Sharing it meant jeopardizing the very survival she had fought so hard to secure. She looked down at the man, broken and shivering on her floor. He was not a mocker now. He was a father, terrified for his child. The choice was not a choice. It was a reflection of who she had become in this hole in the ground. She had not survived merely to hoard her existence. She had survived to live. She moved with a purpose that left no room for hesitation. She stirred the stew she had simmering over the fire, ladling a hot cup for him. While he drank, she went to work. She pulled out a small sled she had built from scavenged planks. She loaded it with firewood, as much as it could hold. She went to her hearth and pulled out several of the clay bricks that formed its base, now radiating a deep, penetrating heat. She wrapped them in old sacks, creating primitive warming stones. She went to one of the cows, who looked at her with placid brown eyes, and filled a large jug with fresh, warm milk. She whistled for Boro, who would be her guide and her guard in the whiteout. She helped Gable to his feet, handed him a wrapped brick to hold against his chest, and prepared to step out into the maw of the storm. She was risking her own life for the man who had declared her a fool, to save the family of the man who had laughed at her chances of survival. The journey to the town was a battle against a living thing. The wind was a physical wall, and the snow was a blinding fog that reduced visibility to zero. Only Boro, his nose to the ground, his instincts unerring, could find the way. They fought for every step. When they finally burst through the door of Gable's house, the scene was worse than she had imagined. The air was dangerously cold, the fire in the hearth long dead. Gable's wife was huddled in a corner with their 3 children, all of them wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale and their lips tinged with blue. The youngest boy was breathing in shallow, rattling gasps. Ilara did not speak. She acted. She cleared the dead ashes from the fireplace, and, with the skill of long practice, used a handful of dry tinder from her pocket to build a new fire with the wood she had brought. The flames caught, a small miracle of orange in the gray, freezing room. She placed the hot bricks in the bed with the children, their stored warmth seeping into the cold blankets. She heated the milk and helped Gable's wife coax a few sips into the sick child. The warmth began to push back the cold, slowly, painfully. Gable watched her, his face a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a profound, shattering shame. He saw not a wild girl from a hole in the ground, but a woman of immense competence and quiet, unshakable strength. When the worst of the storm finally broke 2 days later, Gable insisted on bringing his family to her shelter. They were still low on wood, and his son was still weak. He wanted them to be in the one place in the county that was truly safe. As his wife and children stepped down into Ilara's home, they stopped, stunned into silence. Their eyes, accustomed to the freezing dimness of their own house, widened at what they saw. It was not a dirty hole. It was a clean, ordered, and miraculously warm space. It smelled of earth, wood smoke, and baking bread. They stared at the neat rows of firewood stacked against one wall. They saw the cistern, full of clear water. They looked into the adjoining chamber and saw the 2 healthy cows and the flock of chickens, all of them calm and safe, separated from the living space by a sturdy brick wall. Green shoots were even growing in a small box of earth she kept near the hearth. Life, impossible life, was thriving underground while the world above had frozen to death. Gable looked at the interlocking systems, the ingenious use of earth and wood, the sheer, back-breaking labor it all represented. He looked at the evidence of a foresight and resilience he could not comprehend. He had built his life on the surface, on the conventions of men, and it had failed him. She had built her life within the earth, in defiance of convention, and she had triumphed. He turned to Ilara, his eyes filled with a humility that stripped away all his years of pride. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong. We called you a fool. We laughed at you." He shook his head, a look of awe on his face. "My God, we were the fools." Ilara felt the weight of his admission, the final, complete vindication. There was no triumph in her, only a quiet, weary peace. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his mockery. Her victory needed no announcement. It was in the warm air they were breathing, the food she was offering, the life she was protecting. She simply picked up a wooden bowl, filled it with the hot stew from the pot, and handed it to his wife. "There is food," she said. "Eat. Sit by the fire." Her grace was more powerful than any rebuke. It was the final stone laid in the foundation of her new life. In the weeks after the Great Blizzard, Ilara's hold became the heart of Promise Creek's recovery. Half the town's livestock had perished. Many people were sick, their food stores ruined. Ilara's 2 cows and flock of chickens became a source of survival. She shared her milk, her eggs, and what little smoked meat she had stored. People no longer came to stare or to pity. They came to trade, offering labor, seeds for the spring, or whatever meager goods they had saved. They came to learn. Young men, who had once snickered at the folly girl, now stood in respectful silence as she explained the principles of a thermal mass hearth or the construction of a subterranean stable. The derisive nicknames died on their lips, replaced by a quiet reverence. They began to call her home the Heartwood House, for it was built into the heart of the great tree and had become the living heart of their community. The blizzard of '83 changed Promise Creek forever. The old ways of building, of standing tall and defiant against the elements, had been proven a fatal arrogance. The following spring, new structures began to rise from the ashes of the old, but they were different. People began building their homes lower to the ground, with cellars dug deep into the earth for storage and shelter. They built barns nestled into the sides of hills, using the land itself as a wall against the wind. The lessons learned from Ilara's survival were written into the new architecture of the town. Her methods, once seen as madness, had become the new wisdom. Her story spread, carried by trappers and traders to other settlements in the territory. It became a frontier legend, the story of the young widow who had been cast out with nothing and had built a fortress from a fallen tree. The land that had been deemed worthless became a landmark. The Heartwood House was not just a home. It was a testament to the idea that what one person sees as a ruin, another can see as a foundation. It stood as proof that true strength was not about conquering nature, but about finding one's place within it. Years passed. Ilara never left her homestead. It grew with her. Mosses and vines covered the great root ball, turning the raw cliff of earth into a living green wall. She built a small mill powered by a nearby stream. Her livestock herd grew. She never remarried, finding a deep and abiding companionship in her solitude, in the rhythms of her land, and in the quiet loyalty of Boro's descendants. She watched from her hillside as Promise Creek healed and grew, a stronger, wiser town for having been broken. She had been cast out, stripped of everything, and left for dead. But in the wreckage, she had found her strength. She built her life not just with wood and stone and clay, but with a silent, ferocious refusal to be defeated. Her legacy was not in the cleverness of her design, but in the character that had endured the loneliness to build it, and the grace that had opened its door to the very people who had scorned her. She stood, watching the sun set behind the mountains, a woman made not of flesh and bone, but of earth and wood, and an unbreakable will.